Good evening. A very warm welcome to the General Society Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. I'm delighted you could be here this evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Programme Director for the General Society. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. A little overview of the General Society for those of you who may be less familiar. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785, 231 years ago. The city was founded to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through its educational and cultural programs. These educational and cultural programs are still ongoing, and they include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, this lecture series, of which it's nearly 200 years old. We've been doing lectures for nearly 200 years. The library, of course, which you're in this evening, and you will find information on library membership on the registration table. And finally, our Lock Museum, for those of you who haven't been here before, and you're welcome to have a look afterwards. You will also find an informational postcard that will give you some background on the General Society on your seat. Our speaker tonight is John Strausbaugh, who is here to talk about his new book, City of Sedition, The History of New York During the Civil War. John will discuss the conflicted role that New York City played in the Civil War. And I also want to mention, very importantly, the book will be available for purchase this evening. John Strausbaugh has been writing about culture and history of the history of New York City for a quarter of a century. We were fortunate enough to have him as a speaker in 2013 when he discussed The Village, his epic history of Greenwich Village, a book that's been widely praised and was selected as one of Kirkus Review's best books of 2013. His new book, City of Sedition, has won the Civil War Roundtable of New York Fletcher's Pratt Award for the best nonfiction book of 2016. It has also been optioned for television by the Weinstein Company, and it is no wonder, with such a fascinating and engrossing history of New York City and such a wonderful title, City of Sedition. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you John Strausbaugh.
Hey, oh, sorry. They had it dialed down for Karen. I mean, for me. I project. And I knock things over. And thanks very much to the Society for having me, and thank you all very much for being here. The book, City of Sedition, is about the huge role that New York City played, both in setting up the conditions for the Civil War and then in the conduct of the Civil War. It's a really big story. I'm just going to do a kind of a fast overview. And of course, I will invite you to buy the book at the end if you want to hear more detail. But I'll try to get some detail in here tonight, just to at least give you an idea. It's a story that has kind of faded from traditional narratives about the Civil War. I think that's partly because people outside of New York City get sick to death of hearing New Yorkers talk about how important New York City is. But probably the more serious reason is that an awful lot of Civil War history is written from a military history point of view. It's battlefield history. And although New York played a huge role on the battlefields, all the battlefields through the war, the nearest one was 200 miles away. So I think the city itself kind of gets written out of the history. So that's one of the reasons I wrote it back in this book. I say that the City of New York played a hugely confused role in the Civil War because it was there was no city in the North that was more of a help to Lincoln in conducting the war, and there was no city in the North that was more of a hindrance to him. There was no city that raised more men and materiel and money to prosecute that war, and no city in the North raised more hell against that war at the same time. So, the giant metropolis rarely speaks with one voice, and it certainly did not during the Civil War. Let's talk a little at first about hugeness, about how huge New York City was, because I think now that the American population is much more dispersed across the continent, it's a little harder to picture what a giant, dominant metropolis New York City was in 1860. Washington was the nation's capital politically, but New York was the capital in just about every other way that made a difference. It was by far the most populous city in the country. There were some 800,000 residents in New York City in 1860. Now, in 1860, New York City was just Manhattan. It wasn't Brooklyn or the other boroughs yet. That didn't happen for another 30 years. And it was just really the lower half of Manhattan. By the time you got up around here, beyond 42nd Street, Manhattan was a pretty lonesome place in 1860. So that's 800,000 people living basically below 23rd Street. There were another 250,000 in the still independent but obviously related city of Brooklyn. So that's over 1 million people. The second largest city in the country was Philadelphia with 600,000. And Brooklyn was in fact the third largest city in the country at the time. To give you some sense of scale, Washington, D.C. Was about 75,000 people at that point. It was tiny, as New Yorkers always commented on when they went down there. New York was the center of banking and financing for the country. There were more banks in Manhattan than through the entire Deep South, for instance. Philadelphia had been a big banking center before, but New York totally eclipsed it. It was the center of merchandising. We don't think of New York City as a factory town, but in fact there were more factories and more merchandising going on in Manhattan than anywhere else in the country at the time. It was did I say merchandising? I meant manufacturing. It was also, however, the merchandising center of the country. Everything that came into the country came into the port of New York, and then the merchants in New York City sent it out to the rest of the country, and vice versa. Most everything came to New York before being exported. It was the biggest and busiest seaport in the country. It had far eclipsed by 1860 its nearest rivals, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore. It was much larger than any of them. And it was the media center of the country. New York's newspapers, the big daily newspapers of the time, the Tribune and the Herald, were sent out around the country. They went out on trains and on stagecoaches. So they were really the national press of the day. Now, I say it was hugely confused because New Yorkers, in a real sense, were fighting their own civil war among themselves, leading up to and then during the greater Civil War. And in some ways, it was even a North-South conflict. From the South came cotton. Before around 1800, cotton was not an important crop. It had potential because clothing woven out of cotton would be much more durable and it would be far more versatile and affordable than what people were wearing at the time, which was wool and leather and materials like that. And it was easy to grow in the Deep South. It grew like a weed in the Deep South. However, both picking it and then cleaning it were maddening handwork. You need a lot of people out in the fields picking the cotton by hand and then somebody else sitting around cleaning the seeds out of the flax. The spread of the cotton gin at the end of the 1790s speeded up the cleaning end of it enormously. The cotton gin at first was just a box. You put the cotton bolls in it, you turn the crank, and it combed the seeds out of the flax. It instantly speeded things up, and then when they hooked it up to a steam engine, astronomical difference in how much cotton you could produce. The U.S. exported 500,000 pounds of cotton in 1800, and it was up to 2 billion pounds of cotton by 1860, so that's how much it grew. Cotton was hugely important to New York City. It represented 60% of what the U.S. was exporting to the rest of the world, one commodity, 60%, and 40% of what was being shipped out of New York Harbor. And it was being shipped out of here to the mills in New England, where it was also extremely important. All the mills in New England were built to handle cotton, and in England. Meanwhile, down south, you still had to pick that cotton in the fields by hand. That meant armies of field workers, which meant the institutionalization and spread of slavery. So as cotton plantations spread across the South, slavery spread with it. Cotton threads, in a sense, tied New York to the South in a long and I would argue, codependent relationship. The explosive growth of cotton plantations across the Deep South, all the way into Texas, was largely funded by New York City banks, because all the banks were here. Where were you going to go for your loans? New York City. The New York merchants supplied the plantation owners with everything, from the pianos in their parlors to their plowshares to the clothing they were putting on their slaves, and even tinned meat and tinned food. So they weren't, many plantation owners were so kind of maniacally involved in growing cotton that they didn't even bother to grow any food. So they were importing food from New York City in tins and boxes and stuff. New York not only shipped a significant portion of that cotton out, but New York Harbor was the point of entry for most of the European luxury goods that came back on those ships. So ships go to England, they unload, they get loaded up with European luxury goods, and they come back to New York Harbor. It was silks, parasols, pianofortes, jewelry, a lot of jewelry. That goes to the merchants, and the merchants are selling that to everybody around the country. It also had a huge impact, or at least a very big impact, on the federal government in Washington. There were years in the time leading up to the Civil War when the entire federal budget, annual budget, came from the New York Customs House in the New York Harbor. That's what a big deal it was. And there were many other years where it was a significant portion of the federal budget. Now, the federal budget was quite tiny by our standards, but still, that's important. It wasn't just the New York bankers and the shipping magnates who profited from cotton, but thousands and thousands of New York workers. From the docks, obviously, to the shops where they were selling all that stuff, but also in the hotels and the gambling houses and the whorehouses and the restaurants where Southerners in great numbers came up to New York City, mostly in the summertime, and treated it as their home away from home. In the summer of 1860, leading up to the Civil War, there were 800,000 New Yorkers in New York and 100,000 Southerners visiting. And slavery had been abolished in New York State in 1827, but it was legal if you had slaves in a state where slavery was still legal. You could bring your slaves with you to New York City. So there was this strange spectacle of people from the South walking around on New York City streets with slaves, even though slavery had been abolished 30-odd years earlier. So the people working in all those places are directly, their jobs are directly related to the cotton trade and the plantation system and slavery. And so many, many people in New York, the majority of people in New York, from workers up to those shipping magnates and bankers, saw it in their best interest to preserve slavery in the South. There were other commodities from the South. There was tobacco, there was sugar, but they didn't add up to anything like that 40% that was cotton. New York workers, the working people in New York, also feared that if those 4 million enslaved people in the South were suddenly freed, as some of the abolitionists wanted to have happen, they'd come up north and take away their jobs. So they had absolutely no interest in seeing slavery abolished. So, because of cotton, the majority of New Yorkers and Brooklynites, as a matter of fact, were very pro-South and very anti-abolition, what were called Copperheads at the time, which meant Northerners sympathetic to the South. It's worth mentioning here, it's a bit of a side issue, but it's related, that New York was also a major hub of the transatlantic slave trade right up into the Civil War, into the start of the Civil War. This is not domestic slavery anymore. This is picking people up in Africa and bringing them across the Atlantic and selling them in places like Brazil and in Cuba, where they would work on the sugar plantations and in the mines. Those were deadly, deadly occupations for people, so that, there was a constant need. So it was constantly being fed. New Yorkers of all types played a big role in that right up into 1861, 62. Congress had declared it piracy a long time ago, 1820, I think. And piracy was a hanging offense. But there was very, very little chance that you would get caught doing it. U.S. Navy had 4 ships in the Atlantic trying to interdict slavers. If you got caught and were brought back to New York City, which you usually were, there was very, very little chance that you were going to, there was virtually no chance that you were going to be hanged, but there was very little chance that you were even going to get convicted. Judges and juries in New York were notoriously lax about prosecuting slave traders. Slave traders would be taken to jail and let out at night on their own recognizance to enjoy a night on the town and expect to show up the next morning. Many didn't show up the next morning, and nobody went looking for them. This went on, and there was a lot in the newspapers. Walt Whitman and a lot of the other journalists, Walt was a journalist before he was a poet, were writing about this all the time in the newspapers. And so it was an open secret that this was going on. And on both the Brooklyn and the New York side of the East River, they were fitting out these ships. These ships were sailing out right under the noses of the harbor masters and the sheriff, who had his hand out as they went by, and they, handed him a few bucks. In that whole long history of New York's involvement with the transatlantic slave trade, only one man, one captain of a slave ship was hanged for it. Not because New York courts suddenly developed a sense of probity, but because he had the bad luck to be arrested in 1861. Lincoln's in the White House. Republicans are running the country now. And in those days, Republicans were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives. And the Republicans wanted a show trial, and they wanted to hang a slave captain, and they did. They hanged him in the Tombs in 1862. And interestingly, the transatlantic slave trade in New York City went because it was the first time anybody had been seriously punished for doing this in all those years. Okay, so that's pro-slavery New York. On the other side, there was a small but very vocal and very influential core of abolitionists in New York City. The white ones, okay, early on, there were white abolitionist groups and black abolitionist groups, and it says something about like 1830s, says something about the tenor of the times that many of the white abolitionist groups wouldn't let black abolitionists join their white abolitionist group. The white ones were mainly New England Yankees. New England was a hotbed of abolition, despite or probably because of it was just as dependent on cotton and on plantation slavery as New York City was. So there were a lot of guilty consciences in New England. New Yorkers, being New Yorkers, didn't have guilt, didn't care. I mean, some of them did, but in general, they were making a buck. What did they care? One of those was Horace Greeley, I'm pretty sure bipolar, very eccentric at any rate, founder and editor of the Tribune, and a staunch abolitionist from early on. It was one of the only things he was staunch about. He changed his mind from one day's editorial to the next day's editorial, and he did that for years and years and years. And the founders of Plymouth Church out in Brooklyn Heights, where Henry Ward Beecher, the most famous and infamous preacher in the land in his day, was pastor, were also abolitionists. And they were also involved in merchandising slave-grown goods in New York. So I think there's an indication of the guilty conscience. But they were New Englanders who had transplanted to Brooklyn. It was Plymouth Church that invited Abraham Lincoln to come speak in February of 1860. In February of 1860, Abraham Lincoln has not announced for the president. He hasn't even decided if he's going to run yet. He's such a dark horse that several of the New York newspapers spell his name wrong when they're doing the little announcements. Some of them call him Abram Lincoln. A couple of them just give up and call him A. Lincoln. And because of that, the elders at the Plymouth Church get cold feet about having him come to speak. Churches were for-profit institutions in those days. They were not nonprofit. So you had your services on Sunday or whenever you held your services, and the rest of the time you rented the space out to speakers or groups or for meetings, and you needed to make some money off that. The Plymouth Church elders weren't quite sure they were going to make any money off this Abram Lincoln. So Horace Greeley and some of the Republicans in New York City said, fine, we'll take him, and they brought him over to Manhattan to the new Cooper Union, which was almost brand new at the time. And we all know about the famous Cooper Union speech. It's been said, and I think it's true, that had he not made that speech there in February of 1860, and had he not gotten his picture taken by Matthew Brady that same day, a couple blocks away, the Lincoln that we know, the Lincoln of history, and that giant white Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial would not have existed, because he probably would not have ever been elected. But that speech, the transcript of that speech, was spread around the country by Greeley, among other people. Reproductions of that photograph went everywhere, so people had the correct spelling of his name, and they had his words, and they had an image to hook up to those words, and he decided to run and got elected. Still, although New York State went for him in 1860, New York City and Brooklyn voted against him by margins of about 2-1. Because he represented abolition, he represented the end of slavery, he represented everything they didn't want to see happen. And they voted against him again in 1864 by the same sort of margins. So New York never voted for Abraham Lincoln. The instant he was elected, not surprisingly, Southern states started to secede. They were convinced that he was going to make them give up their slaves, even though he had said time and time and time again that that was not his intention. He didn't think that as the President of the United States he had constitutional power to do that. Maybe we'd get around to doing that later, but for the time being, you in the South, don't go nuts, you can keep your slaves for now. What he was really against, and what a lot of people in the North were against, including a lot of the abolitionists, was spreading slavery outside of the South to all that vast new territory west of the Mississippi that the country had become quite suddenly between 1800 and 1860. In 1800, it was still basically the 13 colonies, and by 1850, it's the continent of the United States. All that land is up for grabs about whether it's going to be free, what they called free soil, or a slave state when they get organized from being territories into states. And that's what the argument was about, not about the South yet. Unless you were Horace Greeley, who believed that the Southerners should give their slaves up right away. But that was considered a radical position at the time. New York's businessmen were panicked when the southern states started to secede, because secession was probably going to lead to war, and war would cut off their supplies of cotton. So 40% of their business was going to go down the tubes. Not only that, but they had lent all this money in the South. There was $150 million of unpaid loans hanging out in the South. $150 million in 1860 is about $4.5 billion in today's money. So it was a significant chunk of change. So they're panicking. They're holding meetings trying to decide what to do. They're writing letters to their congressmen, please don't, if the Southerners want to secede, let them secede. Don't go to war over this, please. They get their workers all upset and worked up about it and getting them signing petitions. Tens of thousands of workers are signing these petitions. So the whole city is all worked up about the South seceding, and Lincoln comes through town on his way to Washington. He gets an extremely cold reception in New York. Everywhere else he goes, people come out, the mayor comes out, there's a band playing, and kids are handing him flowers. In New York, the train pulls in, nobody's there except the police to keep an eye, The mayor, Fernando Wood, makes Lincoln come to him the next day instead of coming, and then he lectures him about how he's ruining the country. This is the Fernando Wood who had just spoken out and said, all right, if our partners in the South are seceding, New York City should secede as well and become an independent port city of New York, so that if there's war, we will be a neutral and we can go on doing business with the South. He got a lot of ridicule for that at the time. However, some of us in current circumstances are thinking maybe we want to dust that idea off a little. At least give it another look. All right, so it's April 1861, the war starts, and for all that they had feared it and tried to stave it off, New Yorkers of all types, in fact, flocked to sign up to go fight the South when the war started. So once again, hugely confused. Part of that is because you signed up for 3 months at the start of the war. Everybody thought that, well, most people thought that as long as it was going to take, that you were going to get your musket and a uniform, march down south, kick some butt, end this unpleasantness in 3 months' time, and come home with laurels hanging from your musket. So it was an adventure, and it was a summer adventure. Also, for working New Yorkers, it was a job, and it was a paycheck. Working New Yorkers were suffering deeply in 1861. There had been a Great Depression in 1857. It's called the Panic of 1857. They were just beginning to recover from that when the secession starts, the war starts, the cotton business drops off, and now they're all out of work. And you weren't laid off in those days. You were fired, and you were out on the street. So they're signing up for the paycheck. Once they actually saw the carnage of battle, it was called seeing the elephant in those days. Once they actually saw the elephant at Antietam and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and the first battle of Bull Run and so on, that volunteerism dropped precipitously. Not just in New York, but throughout the North. And it becomes a problem for Lincoln by 1863, and that leads, we'll get there in a second. And for all that, though, however, New Yorkers did play significant roles in all the battles, virtually all the battles, through the entire war, both as individuals. There were a lot of generals from New York on both sides fighting for the North and the South. There were a lot of units, very interesting units, and I go into some of this in the book. I'm not a military historian myself, but I got some of it in the book. Admiral Farragut, the famous Admiral Farragut, it was left from New York. He wasn't originally a New Yorker, but he was living here at the time. And the immigrants in New York. In 1860, there were more foreign-born adults in New York than native-born adults. There'd been huge influx of immigrants, mostly Irish and German, from the mid-1840s on. And then they set off this alarm and things. Usually it's a cell phone. Maybe it was. Was that a cell phone? All right, never mind. Okay. So you have the Irish and the Germans, and they signed up in great numbers at first. They also stopped signing up once they actually saw battle. Well, actually, the Germans kept signing up, but the Irish didn't. They were like, the heck with this. But the Irish originally signed up, well, and there's some reasons for that. The Irish had absolutely no interest in freeing the slaves and having more black people in New York because they were very busy taking black people's jobs away from them already in New York City. They worked for less than blacks. At that point, there were about 12,000 blacks in New York City, and there were many, 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 many more Irish. They were very poor. So they needed the job, so they signed up for the job. But also many of them were Fenians, and they were seeing the war, fighting in the war, as practice for when they went back to Ireland and kicked the British the hell out of Ireland after the Civil War. So it was on-the-job training for Fenians. The Germans signed up for a very different reason. The Germans were mostly, or a lot of Germans in New York City had come after the failed revolutions in Europe in 1848, and they were called 48ers. They tended to be liberal to Marxist. They were certainly all on the left side of the aisle, and they came with a great interest in abolition from the very start. And before Lincoln thought that the war was about freeing the slaves in the South, German immigrant volunteers from New York City thought that that's exactly what the war was about. So kind of interesting, the difference there. And then there was one unit called the Garibaldis. The Garibaldis were made up of every other immigrant group in New York City. There was like 12 different nationalities. It was such a confusing group that their uniforms were like kind of pasted together from all traditional things from all their different countries. And the officers couldn't talk to one another, so it was kind of a disaster. I want to mention one of my favorite officers from New York City. He's one of my favorite characters from New York City from any point, and certainly from the 19th century. And he came within an ace of either winning or losing, depending who you talk to, the Battle of Gettysburg for the North. He was Dan Sickles. Dan was one of the great scalawags of the 19th century, and the 19th century was jam-packed with scalawags, especially New York City, of course. In the 1850s, he gets elected to Congress, and he's down there in 1859 when he catches his beautiful young wife dallying with one of the handsomest squires in Washington at the time, a man named Philip Barton Key, who happened to be the son of Francis Scott Key. So they had this system where Philip would, the Sickles lived on Lafayette Square, and Philip Barton Key would stand down under their house with opera glasses and would look up at the bedroom window. And if the coast was clear, she would part the curtains a little, and then he knew it was okay. One night in 1859, he's standing down there with the opera glasses, the curtains part. It's Dan Sickles parting the curtains. Dan goes running down with 2 pistols, shoots the man dead like a dog on the street in Lafayette Square. And he's brought back to New York for trial. It was the most sensational murder trial of the 19th century. He was acquitted. There's a lot of theory that he was acquitted because his defense used a then novel defense, which was the temporary insanity plea. He didn't need the temporary insanity plea. His jury was 12 married men. At the time, it was completely within a husband's rights to shoot his wife's lover, his wife, his wife's dog. The husband was blameless. And Dan was out every night with a different woman, but still, his honor had been besmirched by this Philip Barton Key. So they let him off. So now the war starts, and Dan, he's not in Congress anymore. He's in New York City, and he starts his own brigade, the Excelsior Brigade. At the beginning of the war, if you could pull enough men together to call it a platoon or a brigade or a regiment, they were happy to have you. The U.S. Army was very small. It was, I forget how, I think it's 12,000, maybe 17,000 men, but it was very small. And it was mostly out west, chasing Indians around the west. So Lincoln and his cabinet were happy to have anybody come, especially at first to defend Washington, because Washington, or as Washington City as they called it at the time, was, in the South. So, and it was surrounded by Confederates. So Dan started his own Excelsior Brigade. One of their chaplains described the men as, quote, the scum of New York society, reeking with vice and spreading a moral malaria around them. Yeah. Still, they fought bravely and well, this scum of New York society. And they weren't the only scum of New York society who were fighting in the war by any means. And I have a bunch of the other scum in the book. Dan had absolutely no military training, but he was a very enthusiastic leader and a very brave man in his way. So now it's Gettysburg, it's 1863. The Union line is strung out between those 2 hills. Dan's like, I don't want to be here, I want to be up there. So he leads the Excelsior Brigade way out in front of the Union line. The other generals are like, what? They're looking through there, and they're, oh my Lord, where's he going? He's, of course, instantly surrounded by Confederates. There's hectic slaughter for a few minutes. And then Dan's men the Excelsior Brigade is running to get back to the Union line. Dan is shot off his horse by a cannonball and taken to the Army hospital tent. And it's his right leg, and they remove it, amputate it just above the right knee. Now, in those days during the war, if your limb was amputated, they threw it out in a pile outside of the tent because they were working quick. And then they dealt with it later. Dan wasn't going to let anything so ignominious happen to one of his limbs. So he had it boxed and sent to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, and they were very happy to get it. And they displayed his bones and the cannonball in a glass case at the Army Medical Museum. And for the rest of his life, which was a very long life, right up to the beginning of World War I, whenever he was in Washington, Dan would go visit his leg. Mark Twain said he thought that Dan was more fond of the leg he didn't have than the leg he did have. And you can visit Dan's leg today. The Army Medical Museum morphed into the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and they've got his leg bones in a vitrine with the cannonball, or a cannonball at any rate. Okay, so that's enough of Dan. There's a lot more Dan, but you'll have to read it in the book. So at the start of the war, let's go back to the start of the war. As the businessmen had feared, it had disastrous impact on New York City's economics. The waterfront shut down because there was no cotton being shipped. Shops closed, all the shops I keep knocking things, I'm sorry. I'm very enthusiastic, I think you can tell. Many thousands of people, I think it was maybe 100,000 people, workers, lost their jobs because of all the business that had been lost. But New Yorkers being New Yorkers, that's the spring of 1861. New Yorkers being New Yorkers, by the fall of 1861, they had completely turned it around, and New York was going through an amazing wartime boom that would continue through the rest of the war. They did that, primarily what happened was I think it was in July, maybe in June, the New York banks made a very large loan to the federal government for Lincoln's war chest. Now, these are the same banks that have been making all the loans that created this situation in the first place by, banking the spread of cotton through the South. So again, that's a bit of confusion. But I also think one of the cynical answers to that, and if you're talking New York City banks, cynical answers are usually not too wrong, is that they thought that by throwing a lot of money into the war chest right at the beginning of the war, it really would be over in 3 months or 6 months, and they could get back to business with the South and collect all that money that the South owed them, which, by the way, they never did collect. And then the federal government takes that very large loan and turns around and spends an awful lot of it in New York, because New York was the manufacturing center of the country at the time. The government bought medical supplies from Squibb and Pfizer, which at that point were just little companies in Brooklyn, and they came out of the Civil War growing tremendously and became Squibb and Pfizer. Both sides of the waterfront, on the East River waterfront, got really busy cranking out warships of all shapes and sizes. The Union's first ironclad, the famous Monitor, was invented and designed by John Erickson in New York City and built on the Brooklyn side of the East River. Businessmen, for all the worrying they had done about the cotton trade, figured out how to replace cotton with other commodities very quickly. Instead of cotton from the South, they started bringing in wool and beef and lumber from the West. The first petroleum, the first successful oil rig had just been gushing in 1859, I think it was, in Pennsylvania. So petroleum becomes a huge deal. It's the miracle substance of the age. And by the end of the Civil War, New Yorkers are shipping tremendous amounts of petroleum out to the rest of the world. There's a lot of frothy speculation on Wall Street, as there usually is at wartime. They're speculating, among other things, on whether gold will go up or down, because gold would go up if the Union was doing well and go down if the Union was not doing well. So they were shorting gold on Wall Street, in effect. And there was a great deal, of course, of war profiteering. And my favorite example is the government let a contract to have a lot of uniforms made by what was still a relatively small and young company in New York City called the Brooks Brothers. And it still was the Brooks Brothers at this point. It was wool was very expensive because it had to come from the West on a train, and then they put it on a barge, and it came down the Hudson River. So wool cost a lot. So they started cutting corners. And instead of making the uniforms out of wool the way they were contracted to, they started making uniforms out of a material that was called shoddy. Shoddy was rags that you wet, and then you kind of press them together until they sort of look like a material, and then you shape them into clothing sort of shapes, and you sold it very cheaply to very poor people. Shoddy was what very poor people wore. So the Union Army goes marching down south early in the Civil War wearing uniforms of shoddy. The first time it rains, the uniforms are melting off them. And that sort of thing happened throughout the war. So shoddy begins the war as a noun. It's a noun for this substance. By the end of the war, it's an adjective, like shoddy workmanship. And The profiteers, the people, a whole new class of millionaires is created by war profiteering, and the older money in New York called them the shoddy aristocracy. Now, things were very different for the workers in New York City. After that initial flurry of signing up, and then they go see the horrors of battle, and they're not signing up anymore. And then the coming of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, 1863, shifts the agenda of the war for them and for everybody in the North. They had been told for 2 years up till then that the point of the war was to preserve the Union, to bring the South back into the Union, and that it was not about freeing the slaves. Now they were told it was about freeing the slaves, which was something many, many New Yorkers had absolutely no interest in going to fight and die for. The Germans were happy to do it, but a lot of other people didn't want to go do that. Volunteerism is plummeting, and because of that, in spring of 1863, Lincoln is forced to begin conscription, because it's not just, volunteerism isn't down just in New York City, it's down all through the North. And when the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, a large number of Union Army soldiers go AWOL and just leave. They're not going to fight, especially New Yorkers, but not just New Yorkers. Chicago units that were decimated. And officers resigned their commissions and came home. They were not going to fight to free the slaves. That was not what they were interested in. That's not a story we're told very often, but everybody knew it at the time, and it's very true. So he says he's going to institute the draft. The draft had a back door. You could buy your way out of it. You could buy a substitute for yourself if your name came up for $300. $300 was the average working man's annual salary in 1863. So no working men were going to be able to avail themselves of this back door. So that's another grievance that they have now. Meanwhile, make things even worse, wartime inflation has doubled the cost of everything in New York City. Their real wages have stagnated or even gone down some. So a wheel of cheese, a loaf of bread, a bottle of beer, their rent has all doubled, and their income is flatlined. So a lot of grievances building up among white workers in New York City by the time the draft comes to New York. The first names in New York City were drawn on Saturday, July 11th, which is just 2 weeks after Gettysburg. And the way it was a very simple process. They had all the names on a slip. They put it in a big wooden tub, closed the door. A guy cranked it. And then another guy reached in and pulled out the names. One of the New York newspapers, one of the anti-war New York newspapers, called it the Wheel of Misfortune. So they pull the names from the Wheel of Misfortune on that Saturday. Sunday, which was the working man's only day off, they're in the bars, they're thinking about this, they're stewing about this, they're not happy about this. And Monday morning, they attack one of the draft offices and begin what we know of as the draft riots. Still the deadliest rioting in American history, and this is from 1863. And it's, New Yorkers can proudly claim it's from New York City. They erupt. The city is in chaos and anarchy from Monday morning through Thursday, and finally calms down on Friday. There usually would have been a lot of federal troops in town who could have put it down sooner, but they had all gone to Gettysburg or elsewhere because of the battle, and they hadn't come back yet. There were police, but they were very small, the police force, and were instantly overrun by the rioters. The rioters were looking especially for black New Yorkers, those 12,000 black New Yorkers, and committed acts of unspeakable, horrific violence to the ones they caught. There are some, and those examples have been, repeated many times. They were also looking for anyone they thought was a Republican or a friend of Lincoln's or pro-war. So it wasn't just blacks that they were attacking. Blacks who can get out of Manhattan during this week of July 12, 13, 14, 15, 1863, and many never come back. The community of Weeksville out in Brooklyn, and which is, I understand it's under construction again now, but it's a great place to go visit for Civil War history and for black history. A lot of them settle in Weeksville, and they settle in the Bronx and elsewhere. And for black New Yorkers, Manhattan is never quite the same after this. They had always managed to live with white folks there was some fighting, there was some this and that, but they all shared the island, and it wasn't like that anymore. Thursday night, the federal troops finally show up. By Friday, it's over. The city is under a black cloud because so much of it has been burned. The streets are just strewn with rubble. The official numbers are that 119 people died in those 4 or 5 days of rioting. Everybody in New York at the time, was convinced that that official number was kept intentionally low and that there were hundreds more who actually died. But still, even at that rate, 119 people is more people than had ever died in any other riot in American history. Workers were not the only class of New Yorkers who were very anti-war and very unhappy about the war. Several of the city's newspaper editors were vehemently against the war. And in the years leading up to the war, there were no papers in the country, anywhere in the South, the Savannah, the Atlanta this, the New Orleans that, whatever, that were more vehemently, vilely racist than papers out of New York. So that's another thing to think about. They were very anti-Lincoln. Not Greeley's Tribune, for instance, and not the New York Times, started by Greeley's protege in 1851. But a lot of the papers were very, very racist and very against the war once the war started. Benjamin Wood, Fernando Wood's brother, Mayor Fernando Wood's brother, edited the paper, the Daily News, not today's Daily News, but the Daily News of that point. He called for open revolt against Lincoln and against the war in his editorials. He called Lincoln and his cabinet the hyenas of war. He also wrote what's believed to be the only anti-war novel written in the North during the Civil War. It was called Fort Lafayette for the fort that was off Brooklyn, where the Verrazzano Bridge is now. Lincoln had several of these papers shut down and their editors arrested. One of them was a man named John McMaster, who edited a fiercely anti-war paper called, ironically, Freeman's Journal, who went from opposing Lincoln in the early part of the war to outright treason and sedition, which is one of the reasons the book's called City of Sedition. And this is how he did that. In October 1864, 8 Confederate saboteurs filter into the city. The plan is, the war is going very bad for the South by 1864. The plan is that they are going to set New York City on fire, and others are going to set Chicago, the other big city in the North, on fire on the same night. And those are going to be the signal fires to all the copperheads in the North to rise up and revolt and end this war tonight, in 1864. So on the night of Friday, November 25th, these 8 guys go around to various public places, mostly hotels, but also Barnum's Museum, around the city, and they're going to start these fires. They're using a material called Greek fire, which was a liquid. It was the 19th century equivalent of napalm. The only difference was that it didn't work. It smoldered and made a lot of smoke, but it didn't burn very hot at all, so things didn't catch on fire. So for a while on this night, it's a Friday night in New York City. Everybody's out. They're going to the theater. They're going to the restaurants. Suddenly, there's smoke coming out of one of the rooms of this hotel and that hotel over there and Barnum's Museum. So there is an hour or two of panic in New York and the sort of terror that these guys were hoping to rouse among New Yorkers. But then nothing much happens, and the firemen come, and the firemen in those days were, dragged their own fire carts, so they're running down the streets with their fire carts, and there's no fire. So everybody just goes back to having a Friday night out in New York. The saboteurs all escaped to Canada. One is caught, brought back to New York, hastily convicted and hanged at Fort Lafayette, actually. Now, one of the hotels they tried to burn down was next door to the theater on Lower Broadway, down by Bleecker Street, where Edwin Booth, who was the preeminent Shakespearean in New York City at the time, and his younger brother, John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor who mostly did most of his acting in the South, and their older brother, Junius, who was less talented than those two, but also an actor. The three of them are on stage for the first and only time in their lives the night that the saboteurs are setting the fires. They're doing a benefit performance of Julius Caesar. So there's a fire in the hotel next. Well, there's smoke from the hotel next door. They tell everybody not to panic, and they go on with their performance. John Wilkes was in New York rather frequently during the last couple of years of the war because he was looking for people to collude with in his plot against Lincoln. His original idea was not to assassinate Lincoln. He was going to kidnap him and hold him for ransom for the release of Confederate POWs so that the South could continue to prosecute the war. He shared that plan with a few New Yorkers, none of whom bothered to share it with the authorities. So that's another kind of sedition that New Yorkers were up to at the time. And he apparently bought some manacles and some pistols and stuff from a copperhead in Greenwich Village, of all places, a man who owned a violin shop in Greenwich Village. Across the street from the theater where the Booths are having their historic performance, the actor Laura Keene is having a great success of her own. Laura Keene, besides being an actor, more importantly, is said to be the first woman, completely independent woman theatrical impresario and producer in America. And she built herself an amazing theater right across the street, by no happenstance, from the Booths Theater on Lower Broadway. In 1858, she'd had a huge hit with a silly farce called Our American Cousin. In the spring of April of 1865, she's down in Washington doing another play and decides to do a one-night-only benefit revival of Our American Cousin. The Lincolns have tickets to a different play. They hear that she's doing Our American Cousin. Mary Lincoln says, "Oh, we've got to go see that." So they are in Ford's Theater that night for Our American Cousin. So is John Wilkes Booth, and we know what happened then. The doctor, who first rushed up to the Lincoln's to Lincoln's aid after John Wilkes shot him, was a New Yorker. He was a 23-year-old New Yorker. He had just graduated from New York's Bellevue Hospital Medical Center 6 weeks earlier, and he was in New York to sign up as an Army surgeon. And he spent the night holding Lincoln's hand. I'm almost done. New Yorkers played a key role in capturing John Wilkes Booth a few weeks later. Before dawn on April 26th, a detachment of the 16th New York Volunteer Cavalry found him holed up in that Virginia tobacco barn that we all hear about. When he wouldn't come out, they set fire to the barn. They were under strict orders from the War Department to take him alive. The War Department, the cabinet, wanted to bring John Wilkes Booth back to Washington. They wanted to interrogate him about his fellow saboteurs and assassins. They wanted to put him on a big public show trial, and then they wanted to hang him. But they didn't want to kill him before they went through with all that. However, one man who rode with the 16th answered to a much higher authority than the government in Washington, D.C. His name was Sergeant Thomas Boston Corbett. He'd been born in London in 1832 and then came to New York City with his family as a kid in the early 1840s. Then he was upstate working as a hatter in a hat factory, and it's probably then that he developed his dementia. Hatters, the felt for hats, they hand dipped it in a mercury solution so that it got soft. The mercury built up in their systems over time, and dementia was so common among people in that line of work that it led to the saying, "mad as a hatter." So now he's nuts. He has moved to Boston. He names himself Boston because he's in Boston. He converts. He's a street corner Methodist convert. He grows his hair very long because it makes him look more like Jesus, he thinks. And now he's becomes a street evangelist himself in Boston. At the age of 26, while he's proselytizing on the street, he's approached by a prostitute. He goes back to his room in the boarding house, takes a pair of scissors, and castrates himself so that he'll never be tempted again by the flesh. When the war starts, he's back in New York City, signs up instantly, is almost instantly court-martialed because he's been haranguing all his fellow soldiers and including his officers about what sinners they are and waving the Bible at them. He re-enlists. He's taken prisoner, nearly dies of scurvy and starvation in the infamous Andersonville prison down south, from which he escapes twice and is twice recaptured and brought back, and then is finally released in a prisoner exchange. So now he's riding with the 16th, and it's the morning of April 26th, and they're told, you must take John Wilkes Booth alive, but he hears a different voice, sticks a Colt pistol through a crack in the tobacco barn wall and shoots John Wilkes Booth just where John Wilkes Booth had shot Lincoln, or at least he thought it was. And when they said, "What are you doing?" he said, "God told me to do this." His officers were irate because he had violated his orders, but all of the North treated him like a hero and an avenging angel. He came back to New York. Matthew Brady took his portrait. He was wined and dined all around town, and then he kind of fades. He becomes a street evangelist again. He leaves New York. He spends some time in a mental institution out in the Midwest. Escapes from that. And then disappears. And for years, there are Thomas Boston Corbett sightings all around the Midwest. He was the Elvis of his day. And to this day, nobody knows where or how he died. He just kind of disappeared. All right, so in the end, for all the resisting and complaining and rioting and seditious activities New Yorkers got up to during the war was, on balance, quite good for New York City. The businessmen seized the opportunities it presented to amass capital, to expand their markets, so that they've totally expanded into the West. How the West was won? The West was not won by the 7th Cavalry. The West was won by New York bankers and New York railroad magnates, and because that's how you won the West. They had expanded. The petroleum is a big deal. Cotton never becomes the big deal it had been before the war, but they've got petroleum going and all sorts of other goods. So it was really good for New York. They made so much money during the war that it laid the foundation for the booming growth of the Gilded Age, when New York very much becomes the capital of America in every way, but politically, and laid the foundation for what New York City would become in the 20th century, which was the capital of the world. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Any questions?
I'm sure there are.
I just remember seeing the crowds coming to see Lincoln's body. I think, his body was at City Hall on the beautiful thingy.
Yeah.
Were those out-of-towners or had
No,
some
it was
popular?
There's a lot of different. The opinion on that is very wide. On the one hand, the kind of mainstream opinion is that we're talking about after Lincoln's assassination and when the train came through, and there was an enormous funeral procession. Although some years later, the funeral procession for Ulysses S. Grant was larger than the funeral procession for Lincoln. So that's one sign of how New Yorkers felt about Lincoln. At the end of the Civil War, Grant was a much greater hero in a lot of places in the North than Lincoln was, because Lincoln had dragged people into this war and all this stuff had gone on and he'd thrown them in jail and and Grant was just out there, getting drunk and smoking cigars and winning battles. So he came out much more easily identified hero. But at any rate, yes, there was a big funeral in New York for Lincoln. Boston Corbett shoots John Wilkes the day after the funeral train goes through New York, and all New York turned out. Now, is that because there was a lot of genuine grief among New Yorkers who had, hated him and done all this seditious stuff for the 4 years before? Maybe. But I think you also have to understand that you could get New Yorkers out on the street for any kind of an event, They loved parades and funerals, and big funerals were happening all the time. So, and it was a day off. They got a day off. All the shops and businesses were closed. I think there was a certain amount of morbid curiosity, and I go into this some in the book. Now, maybe I'm a cynic. Then again, I live in New York City, so. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question about the bankers during the war. Were they funding any type of privateers against the Confederacy at that time, with ships sort of interfering with merchants selling cotton to Britain or Europe or anything like that? Or was that not happening in the Civil War?
No, that was not happening. Actually, what happened was there was a great deal of Northerners slipping cotton into the North across the battle lines throughout the war, including New Yorkers, including some of the big New York politicians, Republican politicians, who were totally behind Lincoln. There was a period where Lincoln said it's okay for us to keep letting cotton come in to the North because their shoddy uniforms are melting off them in the rain. So no, it was actually the opposite. I keep hitting that thing. When I come back in 2 years, we'll all right. So yeah, no, the answer is no.
Did John Newton sail his slave ship into Manhattan, into New York Harbor?
With slaves in it? Yeah. You mean, no, very few slave ships came into New York Harbor with the slaves in them. They were taking them down to South America, the Caribbean. Once in a while, a ship would come in and they would sort of percolate a few slaves into the population just very quietly. I have a big deal in the book about there was New York money behind one of the very last slave ships to bring slaves into America, but it was down in the Carolinas, yet funded by New York. But no, the population of enslaved people in New York by 1860 was very large. It was growing healthily. You didn't need to go through the hassle of bringing slaves in from Africa, so they were taking them elsewhere.
Could you say a word about the attack on the colored orphanage asylum? Because very few people probably know what happened right here on this block.
That's right, it was on this block. I wasn't even thinking. The colored orphanage was here during the riots, that week of the draft riots. It was attacked. The kids all had to get out. Interestingly, although the Republicans in town all blamed the rioting on the Irish in town, it was Irish policemen and Irish firemen who saved the kids, brought the kids out of the orphanage. But the orphanage obviously was destroyed. It was one of the first. They had various places they attacked. One of them was the orphanage. Another was an arsenal, which was on 23rd Street, I think. It's in the book, because they knew there were a lot of muskets and ammunition in there, so they attacked that. And of course, they were attacking the draft offices. But yeah, thank you. I wasn't even thinking about that.
You briefly mentioned Mayor Fernando Wood. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, I think he served several terms in Congress and was like one of the leading advocates for the South in the House. You want to elaborate on that?
He and Benjamin were both in Congress. Benjamin was considered the more mild-mannered of the two and was the calmer speaker. Fernando made everybody nuts. He had a very supercilious way of speaking on the floor of Congress or when he was just in conversation with you. And he just assumed that he was right about everything. He voted against every single thing that the Republicans, whether it was about the war or not, every measure that came to the floor, he voted against it, voted against it. And made himself a terrible pain in the butt through the war. And there's more about that in the book as well.
Could you tell us about the armories that were built in New York at the time? There were so many armories.
The armories were built to protect, after the riots, they're like, oh my Lord, we need to protect ammunition and our arms and stuff. So they started building all the armories that were there were already things called armories. There was the 7th Regiment had an armory, but it's nothing like today's 7th Regiment armory. It was over like a butcher's shop and some other shops, and in a different location. But they start making them these fortresses we know now to protect what's inside from rioters.
Apparently, after the war, Southerners didn't mind coming to New York to make a living.
Yeah.
Even Jefferson Davis's wife.
Absolutely.
So how is it that they all of a sudden had no qualms about
They never did.
coming to the other side?
Southerners had always come to New York. After the war, New Yorkers aren't welcome in the South. And New Yorkers had kind of never been all that welcome in the South because they represented the money. You know, these are the guys who are loaning us our money, selling us our stuff. You know, we don't particularly like having them here. But Southerners had always loved coming to New York. There was a hiatus for 4 years during the war, and then they instantly start coming back. They were called Confederate carpetbaggers. There were so many of them coming to New York at the time. And one of them was Mrs. Davis, Jefferson Davis's widow, who came to New York because this is a whole long story that's in the book. I won't get into it here. But she helped complete, with a New York editor, helped complete his 2-volume story of his life, his two-volume autobiography. Deadly dull, terrible reading. He was not an interesting guy in that way. And the book sold terribly. Nobody cared about Jefferson Davis at the time. But yeah, lots of them and she became friends with Ulysses S. Grant's wife. Not close friends. They were a little chilly with each other, but still, they were cordial. So yeah, lots of carpetbaggers in New York.
We can take one more question.
I have one.
Oh, okay.
So you mentioned Barnum's, and it was part of the plot in November 1864.
Yeah.
It actually did burn down, or that location.
Many times.
Many times, many locations of Barnum's. But in July of 1865, it burned very spectacularly. Did disgruntled Confederate losers have anything to do with that?
I don't think so. New York was a tinderbox all through most of the 19th century. Fires were numerous fires were daily occurrences. Until around the time of the Civil War, firemen were all volunteers, and we know all the famous stories. Volunteers from 2 different firehouses would show up at the same fire and then get so busy fighting each other about who was going to get to put out the fire. And meanwhile, the owner of the house or the building is standing there tearing his hair out while they're fighting each other. So no, fires were constant. Barnum had so many fires in his career in New York that I don't think you need to think about any sort of subterfuge. Buildings burned down all the time. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You all were great.
John, on behalf of us all and the General Society, I just want to thank you so much because fascinating, insightful, entertaining. It was terrific, wasn't it? It really was. It was just, it was, it was a truly fabulous presentation, and you are such a terrific raconteur and storyteller.
If a clumsy one.
And John, as on typical on these nights, we would like to make a presentation. Now, you might have had one before, but we think you can never have too many citations. So it is our pleasure, and this is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director, who's going to make the presentation.
And John, I echo Karen's sentiments. Thank you. We're already inviting you back in the next 2 years for your next book, and we'll be careful to move that. And you'll tell us if there's bruising tomorrow. Anyway, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to John Strausbaugh, author of City of Sedition, The History of New York During the Civil War, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Right.
And you can say that the library membership.
Yep. And normally we would also present John with a library membership, but he was given his library membership in the last time, and it's for a lifetime, so he still has it. And just finally, Meg Stanton, our program coordinator, is going to make a little memento, a sign of it, and a General Society tote bag.
Cool, to put these in.
Yeah.
Wow.